Hello and thanks for joining me for another landscape photography outing. Today I'm in my favourite of the Snowdonia valleys, the Ogwen Valley, and I'm planning to hike up the east ridge of Pen yr Olwyn to a lovely little mountain lake called Ffynnon Lloer. But before all that, it's sun up and I need to get an image of Tryfan before I lose the colour in the sky. There isn't much, just a hint of it, but if I hang around I'm going to miss it. Now this could be quite complicated, so let me talk you through it. And I do have some thoughts on shooting Tryfan that I'm going to share with you. Now you won't see me use this particular lens very often. It's an ultra wide angle, 11 to 16 millimeters. And the reason I've put this on is because I've got an awful lot to get in this shot. Now you might think that shooting a mountain like Tryfan with a really wide angle is going to push it too far into the distance. Under normal circumstances, you might be right. But what I'm looking to do with this is to use a leading line of this stream, or Ogwen Valley as it's known, which is a river that runs down into Ffynnon Lloer. I'm using it as a leading line. But the thing about shooting Tryfan is there's a classic shot way further up, which I'll be walking up to during the course of this particular outing, and I'll take a snap up there to show you what I mean. It's a classic composition with a wall and a style, and it really irritates me because Tryfan is almost an afterthought as a tiny little mountain in the far distance. The north ridge of Tryfan is absolutely imposing, and from my perspective I really want it to be the star of the show in my image. So I haven't come very far up the side of the valley. I've positioned my camera on a tiny little island in between two arms of the stream, so they join back together immediately in front of the camera. Now the thing about using a really wide angle lens in this sort of scenario is you get absolutely insane depth of field on a crop sensor, which my camera is. But despite that, I'm still using a focus stack of 3 images, and that's because I want to shoot at f8, which is the sharpest point of the lens, and I find focus stacking pretty straightforward. Other than that, from an exposure standpoint, I've got a 0.9 soft grad to control the highlights in the sky. It's still quite dark, even though it's allegedly sun up. It hasn't hit the valley yet. And the thing about that means that I need to get detail in my foreground, and so I need to have my exposure bright enough to achieve that. And so without the grad filter on, I'd be blowing out the sky. Now the summit of Tryfan is slightly in cloud, but as the cloud moves across, it's creating a little bit of drama and the bulk of the mountain is visible. So I'm hoping this will give you an idea of what I consider to be a much better composition than the ones from further up, which I'll take a snap of to show you what I mean when I get that far up. Now, I'm up by the dry stone wall with the classic Snowdonia style, with a composition that I've seen dozens, hundreds maybe of times before. Photographers lug their gear all the way up here, and quite rightly so. It's a really, really nice composition. But what I don't understand is why they don't also take some proper images of Tryfan. Because if you're using this as, this is my portfolio image of Tryfan, for me, it's really not ideal. Let me explain why. First off, some photographers claim that this wall as a leading line runs you round Llyn Ogwen to Tryfan. Well, you know what? Even at 18mm, all it does, as far as I can see, is run straight out of the frame. Kind of just looks as more like a block to me. I don't think it really does much for the composition. Secondly, these particular styles are 10 a penny in Snowdonia. So if you want to shoot a style, there are much easier ones you can find. Finally, and most importantly for me, right now, as you can probably see, I've got some lovely light. I've got dappled sun rays coming down the valley as the clouds move across. Unfortunately, I can't quite see the summit of Tryfan, but you know, you can't have everything. The weather is absolutely spectacular. But the problem with this image for me is that Tryfan occupies this tiny little quarter or even a sixth of the frame. With the best will in the world, it's a lovely shot of the Ogwen Valley, but why not call it that? Because if you want to shoot Tryfan, for my money, there are better compositions. There are compositions that really convey the drama and scale of Tryfan, that make you look at it and say, how do you climb that north ridge? It looks really daunting. As I said, many photographers come to this exact spot, and rightly so. It is a fabulous composition, don't get me wrong, but take the time to take some other shots of Tryfan with it filling the frame, with it saying, here I am, I'm a great big off mountain. Okay, so rant over, shot in the bag, time to head on up to the lake for lunch. And now it's time for a couple of very quick mountain safety tips. Tip 1, never ever ever hang about underneath a rocky overhang. This sort of thing, for example. And the reason is this sort of thing. If you see a rock that is absolutely clean, has got no lichen on it, it hasn't been there long. So if you were sat here having your lunch, that would have landed on your head. And tip 2, when you get up to about 500 or 600 meters at this time of year, even though there isn't any lying snow, any groundwater is pretty much permanently frozen. And what that means is that you can find yourself walking through puddles and boggy areas that are sheets of ice. So a set of spikes or studs that you can fix onto your walking boots are really handy to have in your backpack. This is a pair that my father gave me at Christmas, and they've already proved really useful just a few days later. Lunch break. Low-calorie chicken sausages and hard-boiled eggs, courtesy of the lovely Mrs. G, which is now becoming my staple. No more jelly babies, and at this time of day, no Macallan Gold. So this is the lovely little hanging valley called Cwm Lloer, and this little lake that sits in it is called Ffynnon Lloer. Not Llyn, as you might expect for this neck of the woods. One of my absolutely favourite off-the-beaten-track locations. The great thing about this particular area is that lots of people pile out of their cars down on the A5 in the Ogwen Valley, and what they tend to do then is to disperse into the hills. And by the time you get up here, most of the walkers that are heading up this way that you'll encounter on the path where I was earlier will usually not be hanging around this lake. They tend to head up to the ridge. Right up the top there in the clouds is Carnedd Dafydd, and further round past the Col again completely hidden in cloud, is the summit of Ffynnon Lloer, and that cloud is the reason why I'm stopping here for today. The weather is really closing in fast. All of a sudden, mountain weather forecast had it at about 0 with a wind chill of -6, -7. Wouldn't be surprised if it's -10. The clouds are really closing in. I did have some light earlier on the ridges on the far side of the lake, but that's all gone. So this composition could well be my last up here, because I really do need to get back down into the valley as soon as I can. But yeah, what I like about this is the way the lake just kind of disappears into the sky. It's very much like an infinity pool, because there's lots of interesting texture in the sky low down. The water and the sky kind of meet each other with just the merest sliver of rock right on the horizon line. I'm using the shore of the lake going round as a lead-in line from the right-hand side of the frame. I also quite like that I've got a good contrast between these boulders that sit proud of the water around the shoreline and the water itself. And what I'd really like to do is to try, if I can, and get a long exposure. The problem I've had is the wind. It's actually dropped now, which is a real mercy, but it was gusting to 30-40 knots not 5 minutes ago. So I was having a real problem keeping my tripod upright, let alone steady enough for a long exposure. I've got my bag hooked onto the middle. Then what I do is I lift the tripod up and extend the legs so I've got real tension on it. Tip for you, I've seen people hang their bags on the center column. Of course, if the bag isn't actually on the floor, it's then swinging about, which makes it even less stable. So if you're going to use the hook, which is what it's designed for, then make sure your bag is actually on the ground. Anyway, I haven't worked out my settings yet, so let's have a look at this and see what we can sort out. Well, as you can probably see behind me, this weather is really closing in. So let me just quickly talk you through my settings for this shot. I'm shooting at 18mm, which is as wide as this particular lens will go. And I'm shooting at f/18. I don't want to close the aperture down any more than that, simply because that's when I start to get diffraction and the image will start to look ever so slightly fuzzy. But at f/18 I can usually get away with it. The reason I've stopped the aperture right down as far as that is to get the shutter speed up as far as I can. Now, I don't want to use a 10 stop because I don't want to be in the realms of 20, 25, 30 second exposure. The problem with that is I'm really struggling to keep the tripod still, and it's just pointless because the shot is ruined every time. What I am able to get away with when the wind drops ever so slightly is a shutter speed of about 5 to 8 seconds, and I've got a few exposures of that. Another thing I really like about this particular composition is that by using a circular polarizer to take the glare off the surface of the water, these brightly coloured stones that are lying about a foot below the surface kind of glow through with this sort of ghostly shades, and they give the foreground some interest. Now, even though I was on the mountain at first light, unfortunately I didn't get back down towards the car until it was pretty dark, so I wasn't able to say cheerio to you then. I was dawdling, to be honest, because even though it's dead easy coming down compared to going back up, I was taking quite a few handhelds along the way. As you may know, whenever I'm out and about, I've always got this on a sling round my neck. Now, I don't carry it on a standard strap because as you're walking it's doing this and it drives you insane. But on a sling, kind of hanging down by my waist, it's not a problem. The thing is, the light is always changing, and you have to be able to react to those instant flashes of light, and you can get some really good handhelds doing that, and I've done quite well in competitions with them. Now they're nothing like the slow, thought through tripod shots where you're really considering things and using filters and all that sort of thing. But handhelds do have their place, so I tend to walk along with the ISO set to maybe minimum of 500. And in some of the images I'm about to show you, I was up at 1250. They're not super clean, but they're good enough, and I'm quite happy with some of them. So, I hope you enjoyed this trip out. Thank you ever so much for coming along with me. I really appreciate your encouragement and support. And as ever, if you haven't done it yet, why not subscribe now and join me next time. Cheers.